The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath Admiral Chester William Nimitz as he studied the decoded intercepts in his Pearl Harbor headquarters on June 1st, 1942. The morning sun cast long shadows across his war room, but the weight of knowledge pressed heavier than any Hawaiian heat. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was coming, and this time, the Americans would be ready. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor's surprise attack had dragged America into the Pacific War. Since then, Japanese forces had swept across the ocean like a crimson tide, claiming victory after victory. Wake Island, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, all had fallen to the rising sun's relentless advance. But now, thanks to the brilliant codebreakers of Station Hypo, Nimitz knew exactly where Yamamoto would strike next: Midway Atoll. Commander Joseph John Rochefort, the disheveled genius behind the intelligence coup, had spent sleepless nights unraveling Japanese naval codes. His team had intercepted messages referring to AF, a mysterious target that Yamamoto's combined fleet would assault in early June. Through clever deception, confirming that AF was indeed Midway, Rochefort had handed Nimitz the greatest gift a commander could receive: foreknowledge of his enemy's intentions. Yamamoto's plan was audacious in its scope. The architect of Pearl Harbor intended to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where his superior numbers would crush them completely. He would strike Midway with overwhelming force, drawing out the American carriers, then destroy them with his own carrier strike force. It was meant to be the killing blow that would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific for generations. According to Naval History and Heritage Command records, Yamamoto commanded 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, a force of staggering proportions. But Yamamoto had made a fatal assumption. He believed the Americans possessed only 2 operational carriers. In reality, Nimitz could field 3. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were already in the Pacific, while the battle-damaged USS Yorktown was undergoing miraculous repairs at Pearl Harbor. What should have taken 3 months of dock time was being compressed into 3 days through sheer determination and round-the-clock labor. As Nimitz planned his counter-strategy, he knew he was gambling with the last significant naval force America possessed in the Pacific. If he lost this battle, the West Coast would lie virtually defenseless, and the war's outcome might be decided. But the intelligence advantage was too precious to waste. For once, the Americans would not be caught by surprise. The Admiral's weathered hands traced across the chart showing Midway's position, 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Those 2 small islands, barely totaling 2 square miles of coral and sand, would become the stage for one of history's most decisive naval battles. Here, the trajectory of World War II in the Pacific would be determined not by the size of fleets or the courage of individual sailors, but by intelligence, timing, and the cruel mathematics of aerial warfare. The trap was set. Now came the waiting. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi as his strike force carved through the Pacific swells on June 3, 1942. The same man who had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor now commanded Carrier Division 1, spearheading Yamamoto's grand operation. Behind him sailed the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled, 4 fleet carriers bearing over 200 aircraft. The morning air carried the salt spray and engine fumes that had become familiar during Japan's string of victories. Nagumo's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had struck targets from Hawaii to Ceylon, never tasting defeat. Their pilots were the elite of naval aviation, veterans hardened by months of combat across the Pacific theater. Many had cut their teeth over China and had perfected their skills during the surprise attack that crippled the American Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, prepared his air crews for what many believed would be another routine victory. The Americans, they were told, possessed only 2 carriers, hardly a match for Japan's seasoned carrier division. Intelligence suggested that the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown had both been sunk or severely damaged during the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. This operation would sweep away whatever remnants of American naval power still lurked in the Pacific. Yet something nagged at Nagumo as he reviewed the battle plans. Yamamoto's strategy was complex, perhaps unnecessarily so. The combined fleet was divided into multiple groups scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. The main force, including Yamamoto himself aboard the super battleship Yamato, would remain hundreds of miles behind the carrier strike force. A northern force would simultaneously attack the Aleutian Islands as a diversion. This dispersion of strength troubled the methodical admiral. According to Miracle at Midway by Gordon W. Prange, Nagumo harbored private doubts about the operation's complexity, though he kept these concerns to himself. Meanwhile, 800 miles to the southeast, American preparations reached fever pitch. At Pearl Harbor, the USS Yorktown's repair crews worked with desperate efficiency. Welders' torches sparked through the night as damage control teams patched hull breaches and replaced twisted steel. The carrier had limped back from Coral Sea with a gaping hole in her flight deck and structural damage that would normally require months of repair. Now she had to be battle-ready in 72 hours. Captain Elliot Buckmaster supervised the Yorktown's resurrection with grim determination. His ship had already proven herself in combat, trading blows with Japanese carriers in the first tactical victory American forces had achieved. Now she would have to fight again before her wounds had properly healed, her crew knowing that defeat might mean not just their destruction, but America's as well. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the USS Enterprise, received his final orders from Nimitz on June 2nd. The normally cautious admiral understood that conventional naval wisdom must be abandoned. He would take his two carrier groups, Enterprise and Hornet, and position them northeast of Midway, where they could strike Nagumo's force while remaining hidden from Japanese search planes. The Japanese advance continued inexorably toward Midway. Submarine scouts reported American activity around the atoll, but nothing suggested the presence of carriers. Yamamoto's plan appeared to be unfolding perfectly. The Americans were reacting exactly as predicted, rushing to defend their strategic outpost with whatever forces they could scrape together. But in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, as both fleets moved toward their fateful encounter, the advantage lay not with the side possessing superior numbers or experience. Instead, it rested with those who knew their enemy's every move before it was made. The horizon remained dark when Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga lifted his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber from the Hiryu's deck at 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Leading 108 aircraft from all four Japanese carriers, he aimed his formation toward Midway Atoll, still 150 miles distant. Behind him followed dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters, the same combination that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. At Midway's eastern island, Marine radar operators watched with growing tension as their primitive equipment detected the incoming strike. Major Lofton Russell Henderson scrambled every available aircraft on the atoll. 26 Marine fighters and bombers of various types, most obsolete by modern standards. The Marines knew they faced overwhelming odds, but Midway's two runways had to be defended at any cost. Captain John Francis Carey led his Marine Fighter Squadron 221 into the morning sky aboard outdated Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters. The Buffaloes were no match for the nimble Zeros, but they represented Midway's only immediate defense. As the formations closed, Carey could see the massive Japanese strike approaching like a dark cloud against the dawn sky. The aerial battle erupted with savage intensity. Japanese Zeros, piloted by veterans of countless Pacific campaigns, tore through the Marine formations with deadly precision. Captain Marion Eugene Carl fought desperately to protect the bombers attacking his base, but the technological gap proved insurmountable. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 Marine aircraft had been shot down or severely damaged. Tomonaga's bombers proceeded to pummel Midway's installations with methodical efficiency. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel dumps exploded in towering pillars of black smoke, and the runway cratered under the impact of high-explosive bombs. Yet as the lieutenant commander surveyed the damage through his cockpit window, he realized that another strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the base's ability to launch attacks against the Japanese fleet. Naval Historical Center records indicate that Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo at 700 hours. Second attack necessary to completely destroy enemy base. This message would prove fateful. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a crucial decision. His second wave of aircraft remained on deck, armed with anti-ship weapons in case American carriers appeared. Tomonaga's request meant rearming these planes with land attack ordnance, a process that would take precious time and leave his flight decks vulnerable. At the same moment, American search planes were finally locating the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Howard Ling 80, flying a Catalina PBY flying boat, spotted smoke on the horizon at 5:52 in the morning. Banking toward the disturbance, he found himself gazing down at the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, 4 aircraft carriers surrounded by their escort vessels, racing toward Midway at high speed. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles, Adi radioed back to base. Within minutes, every American commander in the Pacific knew that the decisive moment had arrived. The Japanese fleet had been found, and its position was being relayed to the American carrier groups lurking beyond the horizon. On Midway itself, the surviving Marine bombers prepared for desperate attacks against overwhelming odds. Major Henderson led his surviving aircraft toward the Japanese fleet, knowing that obsolete planes and green pilots stood little chance against veteran Zero fighters. Yet these attacks, however futile they might seem, would serve a crucial purpose. They would keep Nagumo's attention focused on defending his fleet rather than preparing for offensive operations. As morning light spread across the Pacific, both sides moved toward the climactic confrontation that would determine the war's trajectory. The Japanese had achieved tactical success at Midway, but their strategic situation was about to change dramatically. Unknown to Nagumo, 3 American aircraft carriers were already launching their own strikes, guided by the precise intelligence that would turn Japan's moment of triumph into the beginning of its long defeat. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo paced the bridge of the Akagi as conflicting reports flooded in. During the morning hours of June 4th, 1942. The attack on Midway had succeeded tactically, but Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's request for a second strike created an agonizing dilemma. His reserve aircraft sat on the flight decks, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for enemy warships. Rearming them for another land attack would require at least an hour of precious time. The decision became more complex when American bombers from Midway began their desperate attacks on the Japanese fleet. Starting at 700 hours, waves of obsolete American aircraft threw themselves against the carrier formation with suicidal courage. Major Lofton Russell Henderson led his Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 in a doomed attack against the Hiryu, his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers struggling against swarms of defending Zeros. Captain Richard Ernest Fleming pressed home his attack despite overwhelming opposition, diving through intensive anti-aircraft fire to strike at the Japanese carriers. His Marine Vindicator dive bomber, along with most of his squadron, was shot down by the defending Combat Air Patrol. Yet these sacrificial attacks achieved their purpose. They convinced Nagumo that American resistance remained strong and that a second strike on Midway was indeed necessary. At 7:15, Nagumo made the fateful decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. He ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with land attack weapons for another strike against Midway. Throughout the 4 carriers, ordnance crews began the dangerous process of removing anti-ship weapons and replacing them with high-explosive bombs. The flight decks became cluttered with ammunition as crews worked frantically to complete the changeover. According to Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, this decision created chaos on the Japanese flight decks, with ordnance scattered about and aircraft in various stages of rearmament. Then, at 7:28, a message arrived that would haunt Nagumo for the rest of his life. Warrant Officer Amari Tone, flying reconnaissance from the heavy cruiser Tone, radioed, "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway." 10 minutes later, another message followed. "Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers." Nagumo felt a moment's relief. Cruisers and destroyers posed no significant threat to his carrier force. But at 8:09, Tone sent the message that changed everything. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The Admiral's blood turned cold. A carrier meant that his assumptions about American strength had been catastrophically wrong. If enemy carriers were within striking distance, his own fleet faced mortal danger. The second strike on Midway would have to wait. His aircraft must be rearmed again, this time with anti-ship weapons to deal with the American threat. But rearming would take time that Nagumo might not have. His first strike was already returning from Midway, running low on fuel and needing immediate recovery. The flight decks were cluttered with ordnance and aircraft in various stages of preparation. Landing the returning aircraft would require clearing the decks, further delaying any strike against the American carriers. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, urged immediate action against the American carriers. "Launch everything available," he argued, even if the aircraft weren't properly armed or coordinated. But Nagumo hesitated, torn between the competing demands of recovering his returning aircraft and launching a strike against this unexpected threat. At 8:37, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. led 37 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise toward the last known position of the Japanese fleet. Behind him flew similar formations from the USS Hornet and the battle-damaged USS Yorktown. The Americans were launching everything they had in a coordinated strike that would either cripple the Japanese fleet or result in the destruction of their own carrier forces. As Nagumo wrestled with his impossible decisions, the moment of reckoning approached. His carriers had ruled the Pacific for 6 months, but now they sat vulnerable, their flight decks crowded with aircraft and ordnance, unable to launch or land effectively. The tactical flexibility that had made them so dangerous was about to become their fatal weakness. The die was cast. In minutes, the Pacific War would turn on the actions of a few dozen dive bomber pilots diving out of the morning sky. At 10:22 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. gazed down at the Pacific Ocean from his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, searching desperately for the Japanese fleet. His Enterprise Air Group had been flying for over 2 hours, fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return. Behind him, 36 more dive bombers followed their leader through the trackless blue, knowing that failure to find the enemy meant ditching in the ocean. McCluskey had made a crucial decision 30 minutes earlier when he failed to find Japanese carriers at their expected position. Instead of turning back, he had followed his instincts and turned northwest, reasoning that the enemy fleet must be moving toward a recovery point for their returning aircraft. It was a gamble that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. At exactly 10:24, aviation machinists mate first class William Frederick Gallagher spotted white wakes cutting through the ocean surface. "Enemy ships below," he called over the radio. McCluskey looked down and saw the sight that would haunt Japanese nightmares. 4 aircraft carriers in a perfectly vulnerable formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft and ordnance. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had finally begun launching their strike against the American fleet. The Akagi and Kaga were recovering aircraft from the Midway raid, while simultaneously preparing their reserve planes for launch. Fuel lines snaked across the flight decks, ammunition was stacked in ready positions, and dozens of aircraft sat exposed and helpless. The timing could not have been worse for the Japanese or better for the Americans. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin, Leslie led Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3 toward the Soryu simultaneously, creating a coordinated attack that no single carrier could survive. The Japanese had dispersed their combat air patrol at low altitude to deal with earlier American torpedo attacks, leaving the high-altitude approaches virtually undefended. According to Miracle at Midway by Gordon W. Prang, the Japanese carriers were caught at the worst possible moment, with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance scattered across their flight decks. McCluskey selected the Kaga as his primary target and pushed his Dauntless into a steep dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher followed toward the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship and symbol of Japanese naval power. The dive bombers plummeted through clear morning air at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, their crews fighting G-forces that threatened to black them out. On the Kaga's bridge, Captain Jisaku Okada watched in horror as American dive bombers materialized from the sky like avenging angels. Air raid sirens wailed across the carrier, but it was far too late for evasive action. The first bomb struck near the bridge, killing most of the senior officers instantly. Two more bombs followed in quick succession, one penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the armed aircraft below. The Akagi suffered an even more catastrophic hit when Lieutenant Commander Richard Halsey Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar bay. The blast ignited aviation fuel and ordnance, creating a chain reaction that turned the carrier into a floating inferno. Within minutes, secondary explosions were tearing through the ship as stored torpedoes and bombs cooked off in the intense heat. Simultaneously, Leslie's attack on the Soryu achieved devastating results. 3 direct hits in rapid succession transformed the carrier into a burning wreck. Her flight deck buckled and twisted as internal explosions shattered the hull structure. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto refused to abandon ship, choosing to go down with his vessel as it settled deeper into the Pacific swells. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, aircraft, pilots, and maintenance crews perished in the flames that consumed their ships. Months of careful training and irreplaceable combat experience vanished in the smoke clouds rising from the mortally wounded carriers. Only the Hiryu remained operational, and she immediately launched a counterstrike against the American carriers. But the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Japan's offensive capability had been crippled in a matter of minutes, and the long retreat toward the home islands was about to begin. Captain Mark Andrew Mitcher stood on the bridge of the USS Hornet as smoke columns rose from the burning Japanese carriers on the southern horizon. The morning's dive bomber attacks had achieved beyond the most optimistic American hopes, but the battle was far from over. At 1100 hours on June 4, 1942, radar operators detected incoming aircraft from the sole surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet, determined to exact vengeance for his 3 sister carriers. Behind the Japanese formation, the damaged but still operational Hiryu represented the last striking power of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty carrier force. Aboard the USS Yorktown, Captain Elliot Buckmaster watched his fighter pilots climb to intercept the incoming raid. The carrier had already survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and undergone miraculous repairs at Pearl Harbor. Now she would face her supreme test as the primary target of Japan's desperate counterattack. The aerial battle erupted at 1200 hours as American F-4F Wildcat fighters engaged the Japanese formation. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch employed his revolutionary Thatch-Weave defensive tactic, allowing the slower Wildcats to compete effectively against the more nimble Zeros. Yet several Japanese dive bombers broke through the defensive screen, diving toward the Yorktown with deadly precision. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the forward elevator pit, jamming the mechanism and starting serious fires. The second bomb detonated in the smokestack uptakes, reducing the ship's speed and filling compartments with toxic fumes. The third hit struck near the island superstructure, causing significant structural damage and casualties among the bridge personnel. According to the Naval Historical Center, damage control teams aboard the Yorktown performed magnificently, containing fires and restoring partial power within 2 hours of the attack. Despite the damage, Buckmaster's crew fought with remarkable determination to save their ship. Damage control parties flooded burning compartments, emergency generators restored power to critical systems, and repair teams patched hull breaches with whatever materials they could find. By 1400 hours, the Yorktown was making 20 knots and preparing to recover aircraft. Meanwhile, American forces prepared their response to the Hiryu's attack. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Earl Dickinson led 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise toward the last Japanese carrier. At 1700 hours, his formation found the Hiryu steaming alone, her escort vessels scattered by earlier attacks. The American dive bombers attacked with the same devastating efficiency that had crippled 3 Japanese carriers that morning. 4 direct hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck, her flight deck twisted and broken, aviation fuel feeding fires that would burn through the night. Captain Tomeo Kaku chose to remain aboard his dying ship, saluting the Emperor's portrait as flames consumed the bridge. Admiral Nagumo, transferred to the cruiser Nagara after abandoning the burning Akagi, watched helplessly as his carrier force died around him. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now commanded nothing but scattered cruisers and destroyers. The offensive power that had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months had been eliminated in a single day, yet victory came at a price for the Americans as well. At 1536, the Japanese submarine I-168 struck the damaged Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The carrier, already weakened by bomb damage, began listing heavily to port. Despite heroic efforts by salvage teams, she would sink the following morning, taking with her the destroyer USS Hamon, which had been providing assistance. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the strategic situation had changed irrevocably. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups, the core of their naval aviation strength. America had lost 1 carrier but had demonstrated that intelligence, courage, and tactical innovation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The tide of war had turned at last. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood silently on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato as dawn broke on June 5, 1942. Throughout the night, damage reports had arrived from the scattered remnants of his combined fleet, each message confirming the magnitude of the disaster. The architect of Pearl Harbor now faced the wreckage of his greatest gamble. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 fleet carriers representing the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, lay on the Pacific floor or were burning wrecks awaiting their final plunge. With them had died over 250 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced pilots. The cream of naval aviation, veterans who had fought from China to Ceylon, had perished in a single day's fighting. Captain Watanabe Yasuji, Yamamoto's chief of staff, approached with the final casualty reports. "Admiral, we have lost approximately 3,000 men, including many of our most experienced air crews. The Americans appear to have suffered minimal losses in comparison." The numbers told a story of strategic catastrophe that would reshape the entire Pacific War. Yamamoto had positioned his main battle fleet, including the Yamato and 8 other battleships, 300 miles behind the carrier force, too distant to influence the battle's outcome. These powerful ships, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been reduced to spectators in the war's decisive engagement. The age of the battleship was ending, and Japan's admirals had learned this lesson at a terrible cost. According to At Dawn We Slept by Gordon W. Prange, Yamamoto immediately understood the strategic implications of the defeat, reportedly saying, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." The Japanese commander faced an agonizing decision. His remaining forces, cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, still outnumbered the American surface fleet. A night action might achieve some measure of revenge, but it would not restore Japan's lost carrier aviation. Worse, it would risk his remaining ships in a battle that could no longer achieve the operation's strategic objectives. At 0255 on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that ended Japan's Pacific offensive. Occupation of Midway is canceled. The combined fleet would withdraw to Japanese waters, leaving American forces in control of the Central Pacific. The initiative that Japan had seized at Pearl Harbor was now permanently lost. For Admiral Chester William Nimitz, monitoring events from Pearl Harbor, the victory exceeded every optimistic projection. American forces had not merely defeated a Japanese attack, they had eliminated Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations. The intelligence advantage provided by Station Hypo had been leveraged into the most decisive naval victory in American history. Lieutenant Commander Joseph John Rochefort, the codebreaker whose intelligence coup had made victory possible, received the Distinguished Service Medal for his contribution. His small team of cryptanalysts had achieved what entire fleets could not. They had provided American commanders with the enemy's battle plans in advance. The age of signals intelligence had arrived. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate battle. Japan's shipbuilding capacity could not quickly replace 4 fleet carriers, and more critically, the experienced air crews who had made those carriers effective were irreplaceable. Training new pilots would require years, during which American industrial production would flood the Pacific with new ships and aircraft. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces could contemplate offensive action. The Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, and ultimately the Japanese home islands themselves now lay within potential reach. The defensive perimeter that Japan had sought to establish across the Pacific had been shattered before it could be consolidated. As the sun set on June 6, 1942, the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet recovered their returning aircraft after pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet. The carriers that had struck the decisive blow at Midway would go on to spearhead the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific to Tokyo Bay. The Battle of Midway had lasted 4 days, but its consequences would echo for the remainder of the Pacific War. Japanese expansion had indeed ended the moment Midway ignited in fire and coordinated fury. The rising sun, which had seemed destined to dominate the Pacific, now faced the long twilight of strategic defeat.